Mark, his girlfriend Lily, and their two friends Ben and Sarah had been planning this trip for weeks. Between long workdays, stressful city life, and all the noise of their routines, they just wanted to disappear somewhere peaceful. Driftwood Bay seemed perfect. It wasn't a touristy place, which was exactly what they wanted. A quiet stretch of sand hidden away from everyone else. Locals barely mentioned it, and the GPS barely recognized it. That alone made it feel like a secret they had stumbled upon, their own little piece of the coast. The drive there was uneventful at first, winding along narrow coastal roads with the ocean visible just past the cliffs. The air smelled salty and fresh in a way that reminded Mark of childhood summers. Birds were calling somewhere in the distance, and the occasional splash of a wave against the rocks below added a soothing rhythm to the ride. They joked, laughed, and shared snacks in the car, feeling that relaxing excitement only a true getaway could bring. By the time they arrived, the sun was already dipping toward the horizon. The sky was painted with bright orange, pink, and purple, streaks reflecting on the water, turning the calm waves into ribbons of color. Mark parked near a cluster of jagged rocks that seemed to mark the entrance to a small cove. The sand was firm and cool under their feet, and a slight breeze carried the faint scent of seaweed and wet stone. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful, and Mark couldn't help but notice that quiet made even the smallest sounds, a gull's call, a distant crash of surf, the wind brushing against the rocks, feel amplified. They claimed a spot near the rocks to set up their tents. Mark and Lily worked together on theirs, while Ben and Sarah unpacked the rest. The firewood was damp, but they managed to start a small campfire that crackled and smoked, casting flickering shadows over the sand. They sat around it, eating the sandwiches and snacks they had packed, letting the warmth of the fire chase away the chill creeping in from the water. As they talked, laughed, and shared stories, Sarah wandered toward a small pile of sand near the rocks. Something caught her eye, half buried and weathered. She bent down and brushed the sand off, revealing an old wooden sign. The paint was faded and peeling, but she could just make out the words, "Keep away from the tide caves." She read it aloud, her voice carrying across the quiet beach. The four of them paused, looking toward the jagged rocks where the sign had been posted. "Probably just some warning," Ben said, waving it off with a nervous laugh. "Maybe there are caves that flood at night. Nothing scary about that." "Yeah," Lily added, nudging him playfully. "We're just overthinking it." They all laughed again, trying to make the warning feel harmless. But even as they joked, the beach seemed different somehow. The wind shifted slightly, carrying a colder, wetter scent. The waves lapped a little louder against the shore. Mark noticed the water glinting darker than it had a few minutes ago, reflecting the twilight with an almost black shimmer. He shrugged it off, telling himself it was just the sun disappearing. Night fell fully, and the shadows deepened. The campfire's light flickered across the sand, creating long, distorted shapes that danced with the flames. They told more stories to distract themselves from the growing darkness, stories that usually made them laugh, but this time the jokes felt hollow. The beach felt alive. The wind whispered softly through the rocks. The waves sounded almost like murmurs, and somewhere in the distance, a gull called, but it was quieter, almost hesitant, like it wasn't fully awake yet. Around midnight, when everyone was half asleep, Mark was woken by a strange sound. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the quiet like a scratching against stone. He rubbed his eyes, sitting up in the tent. The noise repeated, slow, deliberate, scraping across the rocks near the water. He paused for a moment, listening carefully. Maybe it was the tide pulling debris, or maybe a crab moving over the stones. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it as nothing. But then, when he peeked outside the tent flap, his stomach twisted. A figure stood at the edge of the water, just where the waves broke over the sand. A woman, Mark realized, standing knee-deep in the water. Her hair hung wet over her back, dark and clinging to her skin. Her dress, or maybe a long shirt, was soaked, ragged, and stuck to her body, dripping water into the sand around her. She wasn't moving. Not a step, not a breath, not a twitch. She just stared out toward the horizon, where the black water met the dark sky. The waves lapped against her legs, and the wind tousled her hair, but she didn't react to any of it. Mark whispered Lily's name softly, unsure if he wanted to be heard or not. The figure didn't move. When he looked back toward the tent for a moment, thinking maybe he had imagined her, the woman was gone. Just gone. No splash, no sound, no trace in the sand. His pulse raced. He blinked, half convinced his tired mind was playing tricks on him, but the feeling didn't fade. Something about that figure had felt wrong, unnatural. He tried to convince himself to ignore it. Maybe it was a hallucination, or a trick of the moonlight, or one of his friends messing with him. He crawled back into the tent and pulled the sleeping bag closer, trying to shake the feeling. His eyelids grew heavy, but sleep didn't come easily. Even as he drifted, the sound of the waves seemed sharper, closer, like the water was whispering in his ears. Soft voices drifted through his dreams, voices he couldn't understand, but they made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. When he woke again hours later, the sky was turning gray with early dawn. The beach looked normal again, the water calm, the sand untouched, and the rocks still. His friends were asleep, oblivious, and the campfire had nearly burned out. He considered telling them what he had seen, but he didn't. How could he explain it without sounding crazy? And even if he told them, what would they think? A woman, standing in the water, disappearing into thin air. Still, a chill ran down his spine as he watched the sunlight glint off the waves. Something inside him refused to shake the memory. That woman wasn't someone taking a midnight swim. Her presence, the unnatural stillness, the way the night had changed, it all felt deliberate, as if the sea itself had sent her there to be seen. Breakfast was quiet. No one mentioned the night before. Mark's mind kept wandering back to the shoreline. Every time he glanced at the water, he half expected to see her standing there again, hair plastered to her back, staring out into the endless horizon. Later, as they packed up their tents and prepared to explore the rocks in daylight, Mark couldn't help but notice the wooden sign again. Faded and battered as it was, the words seemed darker now, "Keep away from the tide caves." He remembered the way the woman had been near those rocks. His stomach tightened. Maybe there was a connection. He looked around at his friends, laughing and joking, completely unaware. They were just excited to see the beach in the sunlight, to explore safely, and to take pictures. He wondered if he should warn them, but something held him back, a quiet instinct he couldn't name, a premonition that if he mentioned the woman, it might somehow invite more trouble. Mark tried to push it out of his mind as they walked along the sand, but the waves seemed louder than normal, heavier, more insistent. The shadows of the rocks stretched longer than they should have. Even in the brightness of morning, the beach had a strange, almost unnatural calm. And deep down, Mark knew that calm was hiding something. By the time they reached the tide caves, which looked like jagged, dark mouths in the cliffside, Mark kept his distance. The wind whipped around the rock formations, carrying an eerie sound, like low murmurs, almost voices, or maybe just the tide echoing. His heart pounded. He didn't know why, but the caves seemed alive, and he knew instinctively not to go too close. As his friends explored further, Mark stayed near the water, eyes scanning the horizon. He couldn't shake the memory of the woman, her long soaked hair, the ragged dress, and that unnerving stillness. He wanted to believe it was a trick of shadows, but even the way the sunlight glinted off the water didn't feel real anymore. Even when they left the beach, hours later, he kept glancing over his shoulder. The waves seemed darker, moving strangely, and in his mind, he still heard that soft scraping noise against the rocks, the sound that had first awakened him in the dead of night. Mark didn't tell anyone that day. He didn't need to. Something in him already knew. That night, when he tried to sleep in the hotel room nearby, he dreamed again, of whispering voices, dark waves, and a woman standing motionless in the water, staring straight at him, waiting. And deep down, he knew that Driftwood Bay had not released her. The next day, the sun rose over Driftwood Bay, with a golden glow that made the ocean sparkle like a sheet of diamonds. The sky was cloudless, and the air was warm, filled with the scent of salt and sand. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful after the strange events of the previous night. Mark tried to push the memory of the woman out of his mind, focusing instead on the bright morning, the laughter of his friends, and the soft sound of waves rolling onto the shore. They spent the first hours swimming, diving into the cool water, and tossing a frisbee along the shoreline. Lily laughed freely, her hair glistening with seawater, and even Mark felt some of the tension melt away. Ben and Sarah raced along the sand, their bare feet leaving shallow prints that disappeared as the tide lapped over them. For a while, it seemed like nothing had changed, like Driftwood Bay was just a perfect, empty paradise. Eventually, curiosity got the better of them. The tide caves that had been warned about on the old wooden sign called to them, mysterious and hidden behind the jagged rocks. Mark and Lily had hesitated at first, but Ben's excitement was infectious. "Come on, you guys," he said, waving a flashlight in the air. "Let's see what's inside. It can't be that scary in the daylight." Lily frowned, hesitating. "I don't know. That sign yesterday. Maybe we shouldn't." Sarah, ever the adventurer, laughed nervously. "We'll just look. It's daylight. Nothing's going to happen." They approached the largest rock formation at the edge of the beach, where a narrow opening was half hidden behind a curtain of seaweed. The rocks were jagged and slippery, slick from spray and the early morning tide. Cold air drifted out of the dark gap, carrying with it a strange smell, salt. Yes, but also something rotten, decaying, and heavy. Mark's stomach tightened. Ben crouched at the entrance and shined his flashlight into the darkness. "See? Nothing scary," he said, though his voice had a slight tremor. He shifted the light, illuminating damp walls glistening with moisture. Strange markings covered the stone, long curved symbols carved deep into the rock, uneven and jagged, as if made by hands long gone. The carvings twisted along the walls, giving the tunnel a feeling of depth that seemed unnatural. "Those look really old," Mark muttered. He could feel the weight of the history, the sense that something had been here a long time before anyone had ever walked this beach. Lily stayed at the entrance, nervously brushing strands of hair from her face. "I really don't like this," she whispered. The others stepped carefully into the cave. It was narrow and damp, and the echo of their footsteps bounced back at them in an eerie rhythm. Every drop of water hitting the stone floor sounded amplified, like tiny hammers tapping in the silence. They edged deeper until they found a small chamber at the end. There, arranged in a circle, was a pile of smooth stones. The center contained something that made their hearts skip a beat, a bone, pale and weathered, with jagged edges. They froze for a moment, staring at it, before nervously laughing. "Okay, that's a little creepy," Sarah admitted. Ben picked up one of the smooth stones to examine it. "Probably just an old animal bone," he said, but even he sounded unsure. The moment he lifted it, a faint hum filled the cave. At first, they thought it was the wind, but it was too low, too deliberate, almost like a voice, a whisper coming from the ocean itself, carried through the walls. The flashlight flickered, and suddenly the air turned icy cold. Their breaths fogged in front of their faces. Mark shivered, his skin prickling as if dozens of unseen eyes were watching them. Ben cursed under his breath and dropped the stone, the thud echoing like a gunshot in the enclosed space. Without another word, the four of them turned and bolted from the cave, scrambling over the wet rocks and running toward the safety of the open beach. Their hearts were pounding so hard it felt like it would break their chests. When they reached the camp, everything seemed different. The wind had picked up, strong gusts, whipping sand and sea spray around them. The waves crashed closer to the shore than they should have, though the tide hadn't changed. Lily's eyes darted nervously around their campsite. "I swear," she said, her voice trembling, "it feels like someone's watching us." Mark tried to reassure her. "It's just the cave," he said. "Probably just leftover wind from the rocks. We're fine." But none of them really felt fine. That night, the air grew colder, the wind louder, and the beach darker than it had any right to be. They lay in their tents, listening to the ocean's strange rhythm, each sound magnified in the oppressive stillness. Sleep didn't come easily. Every small noise, a wave crashing, a branch snapping, a bird stirring in the shadows, jolted them awake. Around 2 a.m., a scream tore through the darkness. Sarah's voice, high and panicked, sent Mark and Ben bolting from their tents. Lily was already upright, shivering in fear. "Something's outside," Sarah shouted. "I can hear it. Breathing. Right next to my ear." Mark grabbed a flashlight, fumbling as he turned it on, casting a harsh beam across the sand. The light caught a series of wet footprints leading from the water toward their tents, then back toward the cave. They stopped abruptly, hovering in the damp sand, as though whoever or whatever made them had walked slowly, carefully, leaving a message in the grains of earth. "Who could? Who would be out here?" Ben whispered, his voice cracking. "It's the middle of the night." Lily shook her head. "I don't know, but I don't want to find out." They huddled together, flashlight beams trembling, hearts pounding in unison. The sounds of the ocean seemed louder now, heavier, like it carried a low hum beneath the crash of waves. Somewhere in the distance, a gull cried, but it sounded hollow, almost like a warning. None of them slept again that night. They sat close together in their tents, listening. Every scrape of sand, every slap of water against the rocks, every whisper of wind through the seaweed made them jump. The ocean was no longer just water. It was alive, restless, watching, waiting. As dawn approached, gray and cold, the four friends quietly packed their things. No one spoke much, each lost in their own thoughts, each glancing nervously toward the tide caves. The once playful, adventurous beach had become a place of tension and dread. Even as they finished, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He glanced once more toward the dark opening of the largest cave. The stones in a circle, the strange carvings, the pale bone, all of it seemed to hum in his mind, even in daylight. It was as if the cave itself was breathing, alive with secrets. He noticed the sand had shifted strangely in places. Small depressions, wet, glistening, leading from the water to the rocks. He frowned, his stomach turning. It was like the footprints from the night were still there, etched into the beach, undisturbed by tide or wind. The sense of being watched had not left him. He felt a chill, though the sun was now rising brightly, as they finally carried their packs toward the car. The wind picked up again. It was sharp, whipping their hair into their faces, carrying the smell of salt and something else. Something rotten. Mark looked over at Lily and saw the same fear mirrored in her eyes. "I told you," she whispered. "It's not just the caves. Something's here." He wanted to argue, to rationalize it, but the images of the night kept returning. The scraping sound, the flickering flashlight, the cold air, the faint hum, the feeling of unseen eyes. He didn't know what they had stirred in the cave, or what had followed them back to their camp, but deep down, he knew the peace they had hoped for was gone. Driftwood Bay had changed. By the time they got into the car and drove away from the beach, the sun had fully risen. But Mark couldn't shake the thought that the caves were still alive, still waiting, still whispering. He glanced back once, toward the jagged rocks at the far end of the beach, and for a brief second, thought he saw movement, a shadow slipping between the stones, almost as if it were watching them leave, even in the safety of the car. The memory of the caves, the wet footprints, and the strange hum followed him. He realized that Driftwood Bay was not just a quiet, hidden beach. It was something else entirely, something ancient, restless, and hungry for attention. That night, long after they reached a motel in the nearby town, Mark couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the cave entrance, the stones, the bone, and he heard that soft, low hum rising from the ocean, calling his name. And in the corner of his mind, a whisper lingered. The tide caves were not done with them. The night had been quiet for only a short while when the sky began to darken unnaturally. The wind picked up, whipping sand and sea spray across Driftwood Bay. Mark had a bad feeling from the start, but he tried to dismiss it, blaming the uneven weather that often came off the coast. By the time the first streaks of lightning lit the horizon, the storm had fully rolled in. Waves smashed violently against the rocks, sending salty mist over the sand in their camp. The tents groaned under the gusts, flapping like sails in a hurricane. Mark shouted over the roar of the storm, "Grab your bags, get everything packed, now." He could barely hear his own voice as the wind ripped through the cove, and the rain had begun pelting them like icy needles. Everyone scrambled, struggling to secure tents and belongings. Lily clutched her bag to her chest, her hair plastered to her face by the rain, her eyes wide with panic. Ben was trying to tie down the tents, and Mark noticed for the first time that Sarah's tent flap was swinging violently, open to the elements. He ran toward her, heart pounding, but when he reached the tent, it was empty. The sleeping bag was damp and tossed aside, her backpack untouched. Panic surged through him like a shock wave. "Sarah?" he screamed, his voice almost lost in the roaring wind. Lily's cries joined his, blending with the thunder above them. Ben ran toward the beach, calling her name, but the storm was too loud, too chaotic. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the beach in stark, flickering bursts of white. And then, in one of those flashes, Mark saw her. Sarah stood at the water's edge, completely still. Her hair clung to her face and shoulders, drenched, and her clothes were soaked and darkened by the rain. She tilted her head slightly to one side, like she was observing something none of them could see. The waves rolled up around her legs, crashing violently, yet she didn't move. Mark and Ben ran toward her, shouting, adrenaline pushing them forward despite the raging storm. But before they could reach her, a massive wave struck the beach with a deafening roar. Mark stumbled, falling hard on the wet sand, and when he scrambled back to his feet, Sarah was gone. The spot where she had been standing was empty, the water still frothing violently around the rocks. Ben dove in, yelling her name, but the current was strong and merciless. The ocean pulled him under, and Mark lunged, grabbing his friend and pulling him back to shore. Both of them coughed and sputtered, water running down their faces, hearts hammering in terror. Lily screamed again, pointing with shaking hands toward the tide caves. Something inside the caves flickered a dim, yellow light, moving back and forth like a lantern being carried by an unseen hand. But no one had entered the caves since yesterday, at least not knowingly. Mark grabbed his flashlight, shaking in the storm, and ran toward the cave, shouting, "Sarah, come on, we're here, it's okay." The narrow opening yawned like a mouth in the rock wall, darkness hiding everything beyond the entrance. The wind howled through the cave, carrying with it the smell of salt and decay, and something else, something metallic, tangy, and rotting. He stepped carefully over the wet stones, every footstep echoing like a drum in the chamber inside. The footprints from earlier days were visible again, wet and dark, leading deeper into the darkness. The flashlight flickered with the storm's electricity, and the low hum from before returned, louder this time. It vibrated through the walls, through Mark's bones, and made his teeth chatter uncontrollably. He moved forward, heart hammering, hands trembling, following the trail of footprints that seemed to beckon him further into the cave's depths. Then he saw it. Something pale against the stones, motionless. Mark froze, barely able to breathe. His light illuminated what looked like a hand, bloated, white, resting unnaturally on the cold rocks. He felt bile rise in his throat. He knew immediately, without thinking, that the rest of Sarah's body was gone. The hand was all that remained, left as a grotesque message. Or perhaps a warning. The humming intensified, becoming a deafening roar in his ears, like the tide itself was speaking in a voice meant only for him. Shadows twisted along the walls, moving in ways that defied logic, and he realized with horror that he was not alone. Something stepped out of the darkness, tall, impossibly thin, hair hanging in wet, tangled sheets, skin gray and slick, like the ocean floor itself. It moved with jerky, unnatural motions, yet it radiated a presence that froze Mark in place. It was the woman from the night before, the same soaked dress, the same empty, hollow eyes. Her gaze locked on him, unblinking, her lips parting slightly as she whispered his name. Mark. The sound of her voice carried over the hum of the cave, almost drowned out by the storm outside, yet it reached him perfectly, chilling his blood. Mark stumbled backward, tripping over stones and debris, dropping his flashlight. It rolled, the beam spinning wildly across the walls and illuminating more symbols carved deep into the rock spirals, curves, and lines that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. The figure let out a scream, high-pitched, echoing, a sound that blended with the thunder outside to form a single, ear-splitting wail. Mark felt it vibrate through his chest, through his very soul. He ran blindly. Desperate, the cold water of the cave pooling around his feet, dripping from the ceiling onto his head. The creature followed, gliding over the stones with terrifying grace. The hum grew into a roar, the sound of the ocean multiplied 100-fold. Voices whispering, screaming, crying, all at once. The flashlight flickered and died in his hand, leaving him in near total darkness, save for the faint yellow glow, still emanating deeper in the cave. He burst out of the cave mouth, gasping for air. Lightning flashed again, and Mark spotted Ben and Lily near the car, frozen in fear. The storm was relentless, battering the shore and tossing the sand into whirlwinds around them. Mark ran to the car, throwing open the door and pulling his friends in. They didn't speak, didn't look back. The storm's fury drowned out anything else. But the memory of Sarah, her face, her hand, the way she had been snatched by the dark, remained vivid, unshakable. They drove blindly down the narrow coastal road, rain blurring the windshield, the roar of the storm making every mile feel like an eternity. Hours later, when the clouds began to break and the storm receded, the world seemed to return to a normal sunlit state, but Driftwood Bay, and the horrors within it, were gone from sight, though not from mind. The local police searched the area later that day. They combed the beach, the rocks, and even attempted to find the tide caves. But it was as if the caves themselves had vanished. No trace of Sarah was found, no footprints, no body, not even the whetstones or the carved symbols. The only thing discovered was a wooden sign, washed up on the shore, "Keep away from the tide caves." Faded, battered, and ominous. It seemed like a remnant from another time, another reality, a warning too late to prevent the horrors that had occurred. Mark, Lily and Ben never spoke much about what had happened after that day. Every time someone mentioned the beach, Mark felt a pang of dread, a sense of being watched even far away from the shore. Nights were worse. He would dream of the cave, the pale hand, the gray-skinned woman standing in the shadows, whispering his name. The memory of the storm, the screaming wind, and the roar of the waves replayed in his mind relentlessly. Locals, of course, had their own stories. They whispered that Driftwood Bay was no ordinary beach, that the tide caves were older than anyone could remember, and that on quiet nights, when the tide rises and the wind carries the right sound, you could hear a woman singing from beneath the rocks, and if anyone dared follow her voice, they never came back. Mark, never went near that beach again. Neither did Lily or Ben. But sometimes, long after the sun had set and the city was quiet, Mark would hear it in his dreams, the soft hum, the low whispering, the faint call of a woman's voice. And he knew, with the same certainty that had gripped him that stormy night, that Driftwood Bay still waited, still watched, and the tide caves were still hungry for the next curious soul to wander too close.